I think a lot of people think the narrow gate is sort of being Christ-like and doing good things and go to heaven, and the broad gate is just sending your way happily into hell. But I don't think that's right. I think in the context of who he's speaking to, I think the broad gate is actually self-righteousness. And if you look at our world is absolutely still full of that.
This is the Land in the Bible podcast. All right, welcome to this episode of the Land in the Bible podcast. And today we are in a episode. I'm not really sure which one, depending on how we decide to play these back, but it is definitely about the Mount of Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, if you want to call it that. Pretty famous content.
I would say pretty
polarizing content, maybe very different for things that they were used to hearing in the times. But this first one, what are we getting into with this? Give us a little bit of the setup for this series here.
Well, what I like to do with this one, well, I guess we should back up with that and just say in general, I feel like as a Christian believer, if you believe in Jesus Christ and you want to follow him and you want to behave in the way he instructed us to behave, then Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount, is the core of his instruction to us as his disciples, his believers, in how to act and behave. It is very demanding. It's very difficult. It is very not natural. I heard a guy one time, liken it to writing with your wrong hand. It's just not what you naturally do. Mm-hmm. And it's not what you actually do well for sure, but it's something that we really strive for, and it is our, I also heard a guy call it the declaration of the kingdom of God. It's like the declaration of independence, but for God's kingdom, but this is what we're about. This is how we act. This is why we're different. And I think there's some validity in that. And, it's one of those things where, obviously, if we could all act like it says, the world would be a better place. Mm-hmm. The problem is we don't all act like it says. I had a situation years ago in a missionary context, working in a school in the Middle East, and a parent came up to me upset about a situation. He's like, why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? Why aren't we doing something? And he was very upset, and I can't communicate the specifics of it because it's too personal, but he's very upset about something. And I said, because I think that's what Jesus would do. I don't think he would, basically be against this child because of the circumstances that you're talking about, and we're going to continue to care for them. And this parent looked at me completely serious and said, we can't act like Jesus because they don't act like Jesus. Talking about another culture, a group of people there. And I was like, that's awful. I said, what's an awful perspective? I was like, well, I don't agree with you, man. Like, I understand what you're saying, but I don't agree with you.
Yeah.
And, when we get into this, some of it, I understand thinking that way. When we start talking about, turning the other cheek and trying to be nonviolent and loving your enemies and things like that. Yeah, it is hard. It is unnatural, and it's not what humans do. But gosh, the more of us that do in the world better, so anyway, and it's an act of faith. It's an act of faith in God to say, well, from a worldly perspective, there's no real benefit to me acting like this right now, but I'm going to choose to because I have faith in you. And so this is how we're supposed to be, and so I think it's worth taking a little bit of a deep dive into and really digging into, well, you say you believe in Jesus, you call him your Lord, which means he's your boss. Well, here's how your boss says to act. Are you trying to act like that, or are you not? And all of us are going to fall short at some level, which is a good thing. There's a thing called grace in all of this, but this is the target he hangs on the wall for us. So I guess that's, we want to dig into it. What I want to do with this first episode is just get an overarch, get some of the big themes. I don't really want to go deep into any particularly passage of text. I would like to hit two or three, outlying bits maybe to just get an overarching picture of the whole thing. And so I maybe want to read just a sentence or two from the very beginning, and then a few sentences from the end. And because I think what we normally do, because it's a long speech, it's 3 full chapters, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, is we tend to pull segments out of it and read them. And there's value in that because it's very, very dense material. And it's there's a vast richness in it. And so for any given sentence or two, you can dig deeply into those sentences and, have whole sermons about a verse or two, and that works. And there's nothing wrong with that sort of dissecting. But I think when you do that, you can also lose the fact that there was a flow or a broad meaning to the whole thing. Mm-hmm. Okay. So what I'd like to do is hit that overarching concepts with today, and then with this episode, and then with the other ones, maybe deep dive in some specifics, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
To get started, let's set the cultural and historical context. Jesus is in Capernaum, okay, on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. The Galilee, the Bible refers to in one or two places as Galilee of the Gentiles, which is interesting. So what that lets you know is it was not just a Jewish place. It was a multicultural place. Mm-hmm. There were Greeks and Romans and Phoenicians and Jews and Syrians and Aramaeans, and there were all sorts of other kind of people floating around up there. And there were whole cities of different kinds of people. Okay, there were Jewish cities, but there were also Greek and Roman cities, and things like that, and they were all living together. Sometimes in harmony, sometimes not so much, but at least existing. And it's a multicultural swirl, as opposed to like Jerusalem and Bethlehem and Hebron, like Judea, which was pretty homogeneously Jewish. Okay, so it's a multicultural swirl, and he's in Capernaum. And the very last sentence of Matthew 4 says this. So this sets up, Matthew 5. It says, large crowds followed him from the Galilee. Okay, Galilee is basically the northern third of Israel, okay, including the Sea of Galilee, but also the mountains surrounding it, that whole region. So it's a garden. It's beautiful, big mountains, broad valleys, lots of agricultural, very productive, very beautiful place. It's greener than the south of the country.
Yeah.
It gets more rain. So it was wealthier, because it could grow more things and sell more crops. Beautiful area. Then it says the Decapolis. The Decapolis with the word deca, so 10, polis meaning cities. So the 10 cities. That was a set of cities. One of them, Bet-Shean, is on the Israel side of the Jordan River. The other 9 cities are actually on the other side of the Jordan River. So places like modern day Amman, mm-hmm. Which was at that time called Philadelphia, if I remember correctly, and some of the other cities are over there, Jerash and places like that. And these are all Greco-Roman cities, not Jewish at all. They're all Greek and Roman pagan places, but people are coming from those places to hear about Jesus. From Jerusalem, the center of, the Jewish religion and the Jewish aristocracy, Jerusalem, they were coming out to hear him. From Judea, which means the area around Jerusalem, basically, Bethlehem, Hebron, those places. This says, and beyond the Jordan. So that would be places like later when Jesus goes to Gadara and places like that. So the Golan Heights and present day Jordan. So people are coming from, currently 2-3 different countries, are pouring in to see Jesus. And it says very large crowds. So I don't know what a very large crowd is, but I assume it's at least hundreds of people, but it's probably more like thousands are pouring in to see him, and I think sometimes we don't understand how big these ministries were. We just think of Jesus walking around with, 12 guys on a road, and that's, we just sort of envision this sort of campish sort of scene, like walking the trails through the Judean wilderness and having, in reality, he had a huge following, mm-hmm. This isn't Jesus, it's John the Baptist, but John the Baptist also had a huge following, and And I think that's evidenced throughout the book of Acts, in that occasionally Paul goes into a new city and he's in Greece or he's in Turkey, and he bumps into people like, oh yeah, we went to see the John the Baptist thing. So people in Greece and Turkey were getting on boats and traveling to go hear John the Baptist speak, and then went back to their home, got baptized, whatever, went back to their home. And then John the Baptist, his ministry declined, he decreased, or you could increase. And then Jesus began to have these, larger crowds. And so that's just kind of the reality. Mm-hmm. He had lots and lots of people following. And occasionally throughout his ministry, Jesus tries to get rid of those crowds, and he'll say sort of very harsh, biting things to try to cut back on the size of that following. But it's a lot of people. And it's a multicultural mix. It's not just probably predominantly Jews. It's not just Jews. Certainly if you're the Romans and you're trying to conquer and rule people, you don't let thousands of them gather without you having observers there. Yeah. So there were Roman soldiers for sure. There would have been Roman informants, sort of spies floating around. The Greeks, the Pharisees and the Jewish temple aristocracy, scribes, as they're called sometimes in the New Testament, they would have had representatives there, people listening in. Like, it would have been a big deal, full of all sorts of people that couldn't stand each other, didn't like each other. Some people who did, some people who didn't. It would have been a very interesting group of lots of people, there on that day to sort of, if you would, see the Jesus show. Mm-hmm. And it says when he saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain. So just above the city of Capernaum is a mountain. And so this says that he went up there and he sat down, and his disciples came to him. Then he began to teach them, saying. Now, I think what is key in that sentence is that for the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is not teaching to unbelievers. It says he's teaching to his disciples, the followers. Okay, which is not just the 12. It could be more than that. But those who were following him, he's like, all right, you're following me. You're saying I'm your boss. Here's how we're going to act. This is what Jesus teaches to his disciples. If you want to act like me, if you want to follow me, here's what we're going to do. So for any one of us, that fall into that camp or that category, followers of Christ, then this is for you. Okay, so I think it's important to know this is targeted at. And the first words out of his mouth are these. He says, blessed. Now, and this is the Beatitudes, right? And we're not going to do the whole Beatitudes, but I want to look at least a couple of them and sort of think about how he starts. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And he says, bless those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Now, first off, you have to know blessed just basically means, or blessed, just kind of means like happy, good. Yay, you want to have a great life. You want things to be, you want to be happy and cheerful and have things going your way. Then you need to be poor in spirit and mourn. And so he starts off, it's already like really counterintuitive, like, huh? And really, if you go through that whole list of the kind of people that are blessed, that are happy, poor in spirit, those who mourn, humble, hunger and thirst for righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, the persecuted. And you're like, I don't know if that's really the recipe for happiness. I used to do this exercise when I would teach Bible classes with students. And I would ask them, I would go around and say, if things work out, I'm talking like high school seniors, so 16, 17 years old, maybe 18. And I'm like, if things work out for you, how would you like for your life to look like 15 years from now? You're in your mid-30s. What do you want to see? And they'd all
say low back pain.
Low back pain?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know that's on the radar of 18-year-olds, but it is.
Listen, guys, it's coming.
Yeah. This is where you want to. This is what you're hoping for.
Go ahead.
So, They don't know what they don't know what they should hope for, do they?
No.
So anyway, they would all describe basically, I mean, there would be some variation, but basically it was the same thing. You know, it would all be a relationship, you know.
Money.
You know, the boys would be like, oh, what a good looking wife, you know, that kind of thing. Okay. You know, money in various forms, you know, the car, the house, you know, to be respected, you know, like I want to, you know, a job where people say yes, sir, to me kind of thing, you know, and you would get different slight variations, but basically the same thing, you know, money, influence, power, respect, you know, fulfilling relationship. And that's what they would describe. And so I would, as they would talk, I'd write it down on the board, you know, their thoughts. And then I would write down this list. Yeah. And I would just be like, which one do you want? And they'd all pick their own list. And I would just be like, well, you know, chase it, see how it goes for you. But Jesus is telling you that this is actually the path to being happy and being fulfilled in this earth. And, but it's not intuitive at all. You know, it's not. And the place where he starts is poor in spirit, which I think just means, you know, it's a total complete humility where you realize you have nothing to offer God. Like, I've got nothing to give you in exchange for anything. You know, so when you start with that posture, okay, God, between me and you, I don't have anything I can't barter with you. I don't deserve anything. I can't wheel and deal. I can't cut a deal. You know, I really don't have anything to offer. But, and you know, then God's like, okay, now I can use you. You know, so it's like
kind of like a God opposes the proud kind of thing, because
absolutely.
If you're poor in spirit, then yours is the kingdom of heaven. You're not opposed by.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and then now you're going to get things. You know, God's like, now I can use you. You know, before I couldn't use you. God opposes the proud. Why does he oppose the proud? He still loves them too, because he wants them to understand that they're not all that, and they need to get broken down to this position before he then can use them. You know, and so he starts off and says, you know, you got to be poor in spirit. You know, you've got to have a basic baseline humility, and you've got to understand that you have nothing to offer. You know, I heard a Jewish guy one time who had become a Christian believer, and he was talking about, you know, he was a very religious Jewish guy. He was like ultra orthodox, the guys with the side curls and the hats and all that kind of stuff. And if you study Judaism, what you find is that what they believe in its core, now, to be specific and technical and exact, and Judaism never clearly defines how heaven and hell work. Okay, you read your Old Testament; it's hard to get a whole lot of a theology of heaven or hell out of the Old Testament. It's not really there. You have hints about it, but there's nothing.
What Sheol was in the Old Testament is not really.
Yeah, and you have David saying, you know, I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So he clearly has a concept of, you know, being with God eternally, not just in this world, but it's just hints, really. It's just like a phrase here, a statement there. It's not strongly developed, you know, in any way.
Yeah.
And so there is a general concept in Judaism of like, well, we're not sure exactly. We trust God with it. That's true. But as you delve into things, you know, what you see is it's a works-based religion. It's based on scoring points. You know, both what happens to you next year and what happens to you eternally is based on scoring points. And so the word in Hebrew is mitzvah for like a good work, or mitzvot for the plural of that, good works. And the more good works you stack up, then the better God has to be to you. And if you have bad works, well, that's a problem. And you'll see that, like, if you ever go to Jerusalem and you go to the Wailing Wall to pray, as you're walking towards the Wailing Wall, there'll be lots of beggars that you'll pass, generally speaking. And you'll hear them saying the word mitzvah, which means good work. And what they're kind of telling you is, if you give me a little money, you know, you've done a good work by giving alms on the way to the place of prayer, and God's more likely to hear your prayer and to bless you, you know, if you'll do something. And then as you dig farther into Judaism, okay, so it's a works-based religion. It's based on law and rules. And if you follow the law and the rules, you score more points with God. And if you don't, you don't. then you find that the rules burden is very heavy. Okay, it's actually very, very heavy. So, so for instance, for Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, like if you're a religious Jew, you're a religious Jewish family, then you're going to believe that to have the slightest crumb of leavened bread anywhere in your house during that time is a sin. Okay. So like I've met and known, women that take off like a month or more to clean their house for that holiday. They're going to take every drawer out of every cabinet, vacuum them, scrub them out, clean every article of clothing perfectly to be sure there's nothing. Because what if Johnny, your little son or whatever, was eating a cracker and then that went in his pocket and now there's crumbs from leavened bread and that stays in the house, and maybe God's mad at you and instead of scoring points, you lose points, and that would be really bad. And there's a tension that goes with like, we got to get this right. Mm-hmm. And so, again, literally take weeks off. A lot of people, if you're ever in Israel and you want to buy used furniture, you buy them during this time, because some people are so serious about this that they actually get rid of their furniture once a year. They get rid of all their couches, all their beds, because there's no way those don't have crumbs in them. And you just got to get rid of them. Gotcha. Some people keep a storage unit and they keep Passover furniture and rest of the year furniture, and they swap them out during this time. Because they're so terrified, they need to carry the burden of that. Well, that's just one aspect. If we start talking about Sabbath law, food laws, and on and on and on and on, and like family laws, and there's just, what you see is there's this mountain of rules, weight to carry, and you can't. You just can't. You can't do it. Mm-hmm. And so, I heard this man say, I was doing all these things. I was keeping all these schedules. I was doing all these prayers. I was doing all these requirements. I was making my wife do the requirements for women. And I was, da-da-da-da-da. And he was like, and I looked at God and I said, you owe me. I'm doing all these things. So you have to bless me. And he's like, and one day I realized God didn't owe me anything. And that's, then he becomes a believer. And I think that's what it's getting at, is that oftentimes we want to work and we want to earn it, and we want to look at God and say like, so, I've done all these things. Look what I've done for you. So you need to bless my kids, and you need to take care of me. And, and I need a new car, like whatever this is you want, and you're like, and what Jesus is saying is like, you can't even get started with me until you completely get rid of all that. Mm-hmm. Any idea like that you're doing a deal with me and you're going to buy something, get rid of that. We can't even start. That's the first, I think it's a sentence. It's a clause. Well, I guess it's a sentence. Blessed are they. Yeah, we'll call it a sentence. No, it's not, because the 4, right? It's a clause. It's not even a full sentence. It's the first sort of part of a sentence, Jesus says. Yeah. And you can't even begin to go down the road of the deeper teaching until you get there. Mm-hmm. Right? And then he says, blessed are those who mourn. And basically what that means is not only are you poor in spirit, you look back at the things you've done and you're honestly mournful about it. You look back at the times you failed, the times you didn't treat your wife properly or your kids properly, or the times you did things that were really selfish and really cruddy. And you're like, oh, yeah, that was bad. So to get started with Jesus, you have to reach a point of saying, I have nothing to offer, and I'm really sorry about who I am, And I think you see this echoed throughout the Bible. Men that did get somewhere with Jesus, from a couple episodes ago, you have Peter on that boat where he was like, get away from me because I'm a sinful man, where Peter comes face to face with this. I got nothing to offer. I don't even need to be around you. And that's when Jesus says, hey, well, come on, let's be a fisher of men. I can use you. You've got Isaiah when he had his vision in the temple saying like, Lord, I'm a man of unclean lips. I don't even need to be here. And that's when God, cleans him up and says, actually, I want to use your prophet now. Well, now that you've got that, now that you figured that out, let's go. So you've got that overarching thing, but it exists in a broader context. Mm-hmm. And the broader context it exists in is a religion that has become professional, and a society that has come to value, Jesus is speaking into, religiosity is something that is respectable. And so to be respectable, you need to act religious. And so now you've got like Pharisees and scribes and all these people and the priests and the Levites and all those kind of guys, the professional Jewish religious people of the time. And they are making an absolute study and a show out of doing all those things we were talking about, of doing the law. Like we keep the law perfect, and on Sabbath, on the Saturday, we just sit around and we don't do any work, and we wouldn't dare do anything else. And on, like whatever, and we observe this purity law and that purity law. We don't touch this and we don't touch that. We don't go here, and we wear clothes that are shaped like this, and we cut our beards in a certain way, and on and on and on and on and on. And they're making a show or a display of their righteousness and their holiness. And I really think Jesus is coming at that. Like, if you think you've arrived or you've accomplished something, you really haven't. And that comes into light. So it's still near the beginning of the speech. It's verse 20. So he does the Beatitudes. He tells everybody, kind of like you're salt and light thing. In other words, he's talking to his disciples, you are going to be the agents that change the world. And we'll do more about salt and light later. But, he sort of shares that with them. And then he starts talking about the law. And again, you've got to know the scribes and the Pharisees and the religious people were in the crowd. Mm-hmm. And Jesus looks at this crowd of, blue collar Jewish working people and people from other cultures and places that were also there, and, people that were not nearly so religious. And he says, for I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never get into the kingdom of heaven. So he's like, so you want to follow me? You want to go to heaven? Well, let me just say, you got to do a way better job than these guys. You got to be way more righteous than these people are. And that had to be shocking.
Right.
Because in the concept, again, of how to score points with God, that these people had all been taught. You follow these rules. You do it like this. You do it in this order. You do it on this day. These guys are doing their best to do all that, making a big show of it. So clearly they're very righteous. And Jesus says, I have to do better than them, or I'm not. And you could almost imagine there would just be a general, how? I don't know that I can do that, Lord. Are you kidding me? Because like, how does it work that we can be more righteous than those guys? They that's their job to be righteous. They don't ever have to work on the Sabbath. They don't have, they get paid to not work on the Sabbath. They don't ever have to, deal with the realities that we have to deal with. They don't touch dead bodies. We have to bury people. So then we're unclean, and we don't have to, and on and on and on. You kind of go through all these rules and things. And it had to be disconcerting because they didn't know what he meant. Mm-hmm. Okay.
The rest of this, not to give it away, is basically that on repeat.
Absolutely.
I'll tell you, as a person who came to faith later in life, when you start reading the red letter stuff, the red letters in the Bible, stuff Jesus said, mm-hmm. You're like, this sounds hard.
It's really hard.
And you start reading about adultery, and you start reading about murder and what he's talking about honesty here, and it's like, wow, this sounds tough, but you don't realize what you're saying, which we know he's saying, that's the point. You can't do it, but
and so okay, so why did he reject? Because he said you have to be more righteous than these people. Mm-hmm. So what was it about the righteousness of the Pharisees that Jesus rejected? You got to be more righteous than these people. This is gross. This is disgusting. This is not okay.
Right.
You got to do better than that. So what was it about their, quote unquote, righteousness that was rejected? Well, later in Jesus' ministry, really near the time of his death, you have it's Matthew 23, and we won't have time to read all of Matthew 23, but Matthew 23 is, Jesus near the end of his ministry, kind of just throwing the gloves off and just going at the Pharisees.
Yeah.
And it's a whole chapter where he's like, woe are you because of this and because of this and because of this and because of this. And what he's doing, it makes so much sense. I was talking the other day with somebody I know about a pastor that got off into sin stuff and how awful it was, and the hypocrisy of it all, to have taught this and then done that. And I think we know at the core of who we are that the worst people may be on earth. I mean, Jesus is so nice to regular sinners, to adulterers and thieves and people like that. But to bad religious people, he's not happy with them. And I think we inherently know that a bad religious person, it's like you're taking normal, vanilla, everyday sin, and you're just adding this layer of hypocrisy and just grotesqueness to what was already, bad. But you're just making it way, way, way worse. And also because you dared stand in the place of God and say, God said you should act like this, and then you go do something that it's just ugly. I mean, I think we all inherently know that like ugly, bad religious people are the worst things on earth,
Yeah, and I think it goes to that are typically not representing the what he sets out at the beginning of the Beatitudes that we started. They're not poor in spirit.
That's right.
And they're not merciful. They're not pure of heart. They're not all these things. They're essentially holding, and that's what it's like you see them holding other people to a higher standard that God's saying, well, actually there's grace for people that are in these different places, and they're acting like, no, you have to measure up to this, and not extending his grace out, So
absolutely.
that's a major
well, listen to what he said. This is Matthew 23, 5-7.
23?
Matthew 23, 5-7. He says, everything they do is done for people to see. I think at the end of the day, if we're just going to summarize the core of all of this, is that Jesus is after pure hearts.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't necessarily care so much. I mean, obviously, if your heart is pure, that will then be worked out into certain sorts of actions on this earth, But you can fake certain kinds of righteousness and still have. That's why Jesus also talking about these guys says that you're whitewashed sepulchres.
Mm-hmm.
Your tombs are full of death and rot, but you just make the outside pretty.
Yeah.
And he doesn't accept that. But he says everything they do is for to be seen. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassel on their garment long. Okay, a phylactery, that's the Greek word. Tefillin is the Hebrew word. It's a box typically attached to leather straps. Mm-hmm. And you'll see Jewish guys, they'll put the little box on their arm, mm-hmm. and then they'll wrap it and tie it, or they'll put it on their forehead and they'll wrap that around.
And it'd be like under the hat too, right? Sometimes.
Yeah. And what they're doing with that is Jewish people like to take the scripture literally. And so where the Torah says to bind the word of God to your arm and to your forehead, then they're like, we have to actually do it. For us, we read that and we think that means it's metaphorical, that you should
think about it and put it in your heart.
There you go. Yeah. Maybe your hand or your arm is like your actions, and your head is your thought processes. So, the word.
If you're a worship leader, you just get a tattoo.
Yes. And then you do have it on your arm, and you can skip the whole wrapping thing altogether.
Sorry, worship leaders.
Except for the fact that in Judaism, tattoos are a sin.
Oh.
So, yeah, Jesus Christ died to free you from the law. Now you can have a tattoo. But in Judaism, that would have been a big no-no.
Got it.
But yeah, they're fulfilling the law literally. So they're wrapped. There's inside that box is a scripture, and they're tying it to their head and they're tying it to their arm, and like, look what I did. And so Jesus is like, you get a really big one. You want a big giant one on your head so everybody sees it. You don't just put a little box on your head. You get a big one and you get big tassels.
Yes.
So they always, if you notice even till this day, Jewish people tend to wear tassels, so they're coming down, the men do, coming down on their shirts. And even if you don't see them, they have them on because sometimes they'll tuck them in just to look more sort of Western culture presentable. But they're always wearing it's a square. It's almost like a towel in a way with a circular hole in it. And then their head goes in that hole and that thing comes down in front and behind them, ties at the corners, and those tassels hang down. They're always wearing that. Okay. If it's a religious Jew, they're always wearing that. Even if it's not visible, it's on. And so he's like, they're doing that and they're really, really big. So everybody can see them. Now people see look, see, I wear tassels like I'm supposed to. They love the place of honor at the banquets and the most important seat in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplace and to be called rabbi by others. So what he is saying about them is that your worship is, you're doing all these things not to be blessed by God, not in service or out of love to God. You're doing all these things out of religious pride and arrogance. And Jesus is like, I don't want any part of that. And so when he says that your righteousness has to surpass this, he's like, we don't play this game. This religious arrogance, pride, showy game. That's just not a part of who we are. We care about the heart, not the show. And, I look at our culture right now and I think that's a very counterculture thing to say. I think, that we care about the heart more than the show. I was going to hold this back, but and save it for a later one. But there's a few things that you could talk about, what was wrong with the righteousness of the Pharisees. In the end, it was external, I think, is the main thing. It was full of pride. Jesus also says, this is in 23. This is in Matthew 23. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You pay a tenth of mint, dill, and cumin, and yet you have neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These things should have been done without neglecting the others. Blind guide, you strain out a gnat, but gulp down a camel." So what he's talking about there is something else that happens with man-ish external points-based religion. So if you know the sort of local flora and fauna, around Jerusalem, the plants he mentions here, mint, dill, and cumin, grow naturally there, kind of like weeds. Okay, once you plant some mint outside your house, if you water it even a little, it will explode and just grow like crazy. Even if you don't water it, depending on the season and what's going on, it'll still just grow and grow and grow. So it's basically, these are weeds.
You're tithing out of abundance and you're not giving much out of the abundance.
You're tithing worthless things.
Yeah.
Okay, so what do you do with the mint growing in your little herb garden? Well, it's time to make some tea, and you like a little sprig or two of mint in your tea. So you go out there and you rip 3 or 4 leaves off and you chunk them in, right? While the water's hot, to infuse it with the minty flavor as well. By the way, it's delicious, by the way. And then you're like, well, I have to give a tenth to the temple. So since you ripped off 4 leaves and put them in there, you have to get a half leaf of mint and put that in your, next time I go to the temple, drop this off pile, and you're going to go tithe that. Who cares?
Yeah.
Who cares? You're giving a tenth of a weed you pulled out of your yard. What are you doing?
And you're acting like it's a big deal. You're doing something sacrificial.
Oh, look what I do. I give it. Yeah, that's right. Or at the same time, you're throwing old ladies out of their houses. But you're like, yeah, but it's for the temple tax, which is a practice they were doing. So he's like, you're neglecting mercy and just being nice to people, and you do these dumb things. And he's like, this is not what I'm after. It's not what I'm after. But it's what religion turns into, which is why, I look around this world, when I was working in Bethlehem, so many of the students there, Muslim and Christian, would look at the world and say religion is the problem, because in their context, they're living in in Israel, where you have, sort of this Jew-Muslim thing going on. And their idea was, well, the religion is the source of the problem. If we get religion, this will all go away. And I've heard other people voice the same thing in other parts of the world, because the only religion they've seen is this. It's showy. It's a man-based thing. It's point-based. It's earned. And it's ugly. And Jesus says, this is not what we're doing. By contrast, if you look at Matthew 5, and this is what I was going to keep under my hat, but I'll go ahead and use this because I think it's too perfect. When he starts talking about specific morals, he says, you've heard that it was said to our ancestors, do not murder, which that's true, by the way. You should not murder someone. Like that is actually something we as Christians follow. And whoever murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, anyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Whoever insults his brother or sister will be subject to the court. And whoever says you fool will be subject to hellfire. So if you're offering, okay, he kind of goes on from there. And I'm like, whoa, pump the brakes. Jesus, I agree, if I kill somebody, I should be in trouble. But you're telling me that if I insult somebody, call him a fool, call him an idiot, I might go to hell for that? Doesn't that seem a little disproportionate? So the question is why? And why is Jesus even creating a linkage here? Why is he creating a linkage between murder and basically statements of anger? I'm mad at you, I'm going to call you an idiot or a fool or a dummy. I mean, anybody who's had a brother has said those things. If you grew up in the same house, with a sibling, the chance that you got out of your childhood without calling somebody a dummy is slim to none.
You drive in Atlanta traffic, probably have been angry.
Yeah, that's right. I had somebody who passed me yesterday on the highway, and he sort of squeezed between my car and the one in front of me, and he gave me a gesture, which I think was a gesture of affection and love. Out of his.
Was he pointing at you?
I think he was just sort of generally at the world, with one of his hands as he went by. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was so mad about. But anyway, so yes, I agree. But the question is, like, why is there this linkage here between like something that's clearly way out of bounds, murder, and something that's kind of normal? And I think how it works is like this. When I was a kid, I remember a time when Air Jordans were a big deal, and people loved, the Nikes. Like it was like just a cultural phenomenon.
Yeah.
And I remember that time, throughout certain parts of America, there was a string of killings where people were killed for their Air Jordans. And what that means, if you're killing someone to take their shoes, is that you're telling them that their shoes are worth more than their life, which is a horrific statement that's someone of utter devaluing and disrespect of a human life. Here's a human life. Here's a pair of shoes. Yeah, I'll let you die. Keep the shoes. I mean, really? And really, anytime someone's being murdered, what is being said is essentially that it's more important for me to get this or to have this or just to express my rage or whatever. Your life doesn't matter. I can kill you, and it's okay because I need this money or this thing or whatever it is, right? But it's the ultimate expression that another human is of no value. Okay. Well, when you're insulting someone, you're also communicating to them that you don't value them. You're a fool. You're an idiot. Okay. It's not the ultimate expression of that, which murdering them would be, but it is an expression of that. So I heard it referred to as like sort of like the acorn and the oak tree, that this is the thing that grows into this. Like if your heart doesn't value people, eventually, in theory, it could grow into this other thing. And I think we're going to see a lot of that as we go throughout here. But what Jesus is getting at is, if you want to avoid these big sins, then you need to deal with your heart, where the seed version of it has taken root, and then it's going to grow into the big one. I mean, you deal with people all the time. They're like, I'm fine. I've never murdered anybody or done anything. Like, it doesn't mean you're good. It just means you're not a monster yet, but you could become one. Well, so to sort of bring this to a close, in Matthew 7, so now we're at the end. Okay. So, 5, 6, 7 is the whole sermon. Jesus is wrapping up, and he's got a series of sort of like illustrations where he talks about, he sort of gives like these dichotomies, these two choices, the house built on the good soil or the bad soil, or this road or that road. He's sort of like painting these options. You can be this, or you can be this, or you can be that, or you can be this. And he says this. He says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road broad that leads to destruction, and there are many that go through it. How narrow is the gate and difficult the road that leads to life, and few find it." And so this is what I think is the overarching, if we're going to go for overarching meanings, we're going to run throughout the whole thing. It's that this external, righteousness, self-righteousness is no good. And you have to be more righteous than that if you're going to go into heaven. And that the way you get there is that you humble yourself, you realize that you have none, and then you give yourself to the Lord. Okay? And so a lot of people, because again, we pull things out and we just read a sentence, and we analyze a sentence, and that's fine. There's meaning in a sentence and you can analyze it. Mm-hmm. But if you analyze the whole sermon, when Jesus talks about the narrow gate and the wide gate, I think a lot of people think that this is like, the narrow gate is sort of being Christ-like and doing good things, or Jesus things, I guess, and go to heaven. And the broad gate is, being a wretched sinner and I don't know, whatever, just sinning your way happily into hell. But I don't think that's right. I think in the context of who he's speaking to, a predominantly Jewish crowd full of scribes and Pharisees. And since he set up that dichotomy from the very beginning, more righteous than them, and then other things are examples of that, I think the broad gate is actually self-righteousness. Like, I think I'm good. I really, that's what the broad gate is. And if you look at our world is absolutely still full of that, of people that are like, I'm good. I do this thing, or I do that thing, or I'm involved in this, cause or that event or this, whatever. I'm good. But what Jesus says is that there'll be lots of people on that day, on the day of judgment that he'll say, I don't know you. You do it for me. I don't know what you're talking about. And so I think that the actual, again, the broad gate is like, again, a mannish righteousness. I think I'm okay. So, and he's, from start to finish, I think building a case against that, in a case of need for a savior, because really you look at all this stuff and you're like, it's pretty hard, Jesus. Like, it's pretty hard never to call anybody an idiot. It's pretty hard never to lust ever. It's pretty hard to pray for your enemies. It's pretty hard to, I'm probably going to fail at this some, and you will, you will, but there's a path, and he actually, I think, gives the answer to some of that, and we will go further in depth on this later, but he says in Matthew 7:7, he says, ask and it'll be given, seek and you'll find, knock will be open to you. So he basically just says, he's like, it is hard. This is a lot, but seek, knock, ask, find, like just.
In order to ask, you have to assume you don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
Which means you have to be humble and.
Yeah. Get to that start point.
Get to that base beginning opening line.
And then look the right way for your answers too is probably a good thing. And get away from your self-righteousness. You're not good. And that, I think really comes at our culture, because our whole culture is a culture that says the greatest good is to look in your heart and do what feels good,
Right.
and your heart is good. You're your own best guide. And, self-love is where you need to be. And if you can be at a place of true self-love and realization, and you can just chase your heart and your dreams, then and the whole basis of this is that, no, you need to realize that you're bad. And you need to realize that you're not a good guide for yourself. And you need to again, mourn those past, failings. And it's a completely different, I think, direction and all those sorts of things. So
that's good. That's a good way to end.
I think so.
Bad.
Huh?
We're all just bad and not good at stuff.
We're bad and in need of a savior.
That's right.
That's where it's going.
That's cool. No, it is good. I mean, it's bad. It's good that we're bad and that we need someone.
Yeah. Otherwise, we'd all be self-righteous and we all be Pharisees.
Yeah. And I think, gosh, there's just so many things. We could spend another 45 minutes talking about this. I'm sure we will.
Maybe we will.
Because we're going to do more parts on this. But, when I'm reading these, as you were going through, and I'm just following along, murder, adultery, all these divorce, eye for an eye. It's like all of these are just going back. Well, obviously, it's like paralleling what the Pharisees are telling people they need to do and how they look so outwardly good, but in actuality, they're not hitting any of these things he's talking about. But then all of them are just going right back to poor in spirit.
Yeah.
And I've heard this explained and taught in a class for like, I don't know what you would call it. It's just like a spirit. Maybe it was like just a spiritual development type thing, but about this being kind of like a progress. The Sermon on the Mount, that you first are poor in spirit, and then once you're aware of how poor in spirit you are, God doesn't need you. You mourn that, and you kind of explained it this way. But then that makes you meek, and then you hunger for righteousness. And it makes you merciful. You're pure in heart, you're peacemakers. And it's almost like this building step. And so you can kind of like, you do one, you do the next one, and it's like a growth process, which I think is really interesting, because there's definitely times when, obviously, like in life, we drift in different ways and we're not aware of the things we're doing. But it's nice to have those checks and balances to go back to be like, am I pure in heart about this? Or like, am I actually, I wouldn't necessarily sit around and think this, but like, am I being poor in spirit right now? But you can ask yourself, like, check my motives? Like, what am I trying to get out of this? Or like, what are my motivations? Are they pure? So it's kind of an interesting, what are your thoughts on that? You feel like do you ever think that way or think about the Sermon on the Mount?
I know that these things aren't natural.
Right.
And I've heard the human spiritual life. I heard somebody describe it as, it's like you're on a down escalator and you want to go up. And so, your natural direction, you've got to put in energy just to stay level. And you got to put in pretty good bit of energy if you want to, if you don't take a care or think or, pray about it, if you don't engage it at some level, you're not naturally going to flow like this. You're not naturally poor in spirit and mourning your past failures and meek and gentle and hungering and thirsting for righteousness. Are you kidding me? Nobody hungers and thirsts for righteousness. We hunger and thirst for like new cars and houses and, relationship stuff and whatever. But you don't hunger and thirst for righteousness. Like, God help me just be, more. Who does that? Like, that's not a natural place to be. Like, that's a place that you arrive at, with a lot of help from the Holy Spirit. And, and put up some energy and effort from yourself, I think. So
that's great. Well, cool. I'm excited to do more on this series. So
Awesome.
Cool. Well, as always, thanks for listening to this episode. And for more content, check us out on thelandandthebible.com.
Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, click like and subscribe. It really helps us. And if you really enjoyed it, go on over to our website, thelandandthebible.com, and become a supporter. It helps us generate more content and gives you access to our full library of video and Bible study content.